Medieval 2 Total War is arguably the greatest game of the entire Total War series. In fact, I do argue that in my Total War ranked video. It was an incredible game with amazing battles, the best sieges, a fantastic roster of varied, interesting factions, and an engaging campaign mode. But given that Medieval 2 was released all the way back in 2006, the question has persisted. Where is Medieval 3? So, on that note, I guess I should confirm for anyone who clicked on this video in a fit of excitement, there is no Medieval 3, and sadly, it does not look on the cards. But it's fun to pretend, eh? And better yet, to speculate on what could be. And if Creative Assembly do decide to give the fans what they finally want and are looking for inspiration, well then, I'm Strat Tom, and these are 5 things that I'd want to see in Total War Medieval 3. Number 1. A feudal system. Right, so off the bat, I've had to stop myself from allowing this video just descending into me saying basically, make Crusader kings with controllable battles. And to be honest, the more I actually thought about that, the more I realised it wouldn't fit the Total War formula anyway. However, that's not to be said that there aren't lessons to be learned from Paradox's medieval epic. I don't think that Medieval 3 would work with you being able to control counts and dukes, and I honestly would limit what you can control down to just faction leaders. But dukes and counts and barons should definitely be a thing. I think, in terms of what you spend your money on directly, should be limited just to your crown lands, with all other parts of your empire being controlled by vassals and subordinates. Politics and internal faction management have always been a weak point of Total War titles, and I would love to see this addressed. My Medieval 3 would focus on you handing out lands and titles to your vassals and using marriages to ensure their loyalty. I would have this loyalty system be a key part of your empire management, not simply in the form of rebellion and civil war, but also with disloyal or minorly disgruntled vassals coming up short or empty-handed when it came time to provide taxes or manpower. And speaking of vassals providing manpower, number 2, call the banners. Again, I'm slightly borrowing off Crusader Kings here, but honestly, I always hated the way that armies were recruited and managed in Medieval 2. The game would normally get to a point where your armies would consist entirely of men-at-arms and knights, both the mounted and dismounted variety, with maybe a few missile troops thrown in for good measure. What's worse is that these armies would be standing armies, never to be stood down. It's just a poor reflection of a medieval military system, and in its place, I would have a calling the banners function. When it's time for war, the king calls upon his men to muster on the field and march to war. The troops you had at your disposal would be a collection of all the troops provided to you from across your kingdom. The variety and the quality of your troops would come from a multitude of factors, such as your level of research and financial investment in training facilities, blacksmiths, and armories. I think as time moves on, you should see a noticeable change in the ability, the armour, and the training of your troops. Early medieval battles, then, yeah, maybe you do just have a largely unruly mob of peasants supplemented with knights on horseback. Or maybe some more professional, heavily armoured infantry, depending on your culture. The Saxons, for instance, having huscarls instead of knights. And speaking of culture, I think culture should play a much bigger part as well, with Eastern factions having a horse archer based army. And also, maybe some faction specific unique units. England, for example, could have some higher quality longbow armed missile troops that become available to them over time. There should be other factors that influence the amount of troops that are available to you, such as your baron's loyalty, or perhaps famines and plagues decimating your population. The important thing to remember here though is that armies should be largely peasant based, with a supplement of knights or nobles. What might begin as a poorly armed rabble could become a more professional, better equipped peasant force by the late game, but the peasant should always be the backbone of your armies. Knights should be seen as special and a rarity, which once again segues nicely into number 3, a medieval wrecking ball. Knights should be a rarity, yes, but there should be good reason for this. They should be much more important than they were in Medieval 2. Playing the Total War Attila mod, Medieval Kingdoms 1212 AD, this is one thing that particularly stood out to me. Knights feel like game changers in this mod. The particularly heavily armoured ones are incredibly difficult to kill. I feel like in both games and other media, armour is poorly represented. Now think about just how many battle scenes you've seen in film and television and some games, and you've seen someone who stabs straight through armour as if it weren't there. It's silly. It's silly with chainmail armour, but the notion that plate armour could be so easily penetrated is laughable. In my Medieval 3, heavily armoured units would be incredibly difficult to kill. My next point on this is a purely aesthetic one, but I do feel like the epic presentation of these games is what draws us in, so I don't think that's redundant. I would love to see the impact mechanics vastly improved. In recent games, they have felt incredibly lackluster, both with charging units and the impact of missiles. Both need to be vastly improved. You, as a player, should be able to get a real sense of the destructive power of a heavy cavalry charge. You should see and hear the devastation wrought by them. Missiles too should have a real punch to them. This is war, it should feel like it. This was one of the big issues that I had with Troy Total War, that everything just seemed a bit lackluster. I want some punch back in my Total War experience. Number 4, Farmable Nations. One thing that a new medieval game could bring us that its predecessor never could is a far greater variety of factions. We do get to see this in the Medieval Kingdoms mod for Attila, and it is a great addition to that mod. I would love to see a greater emphasis on Farmable Nations though, something that is lacking for the most part in other Total War games. All the various kingdoms and rulers of the Iberian Peninsula, for example, should be available to play, with the idea of forming Spain as a kingdom being a late game target. A mixture of smaller breakaway factions forming after successful rebellions and the forging of large empires is something that I feel would keep the campaign a more dynamic experience. In Medieval 2, the lack of ability to form the Crusader states was always something that bothered me, and I think the idea of Farmable Nations would keep the map feeling more alive and real. Number 5, Campaigns and Crusaders and Adventurers, oh my. Lastly, I'd love to see some more story elements in the game. I think going off on various campaigns should have some more substance to it. Alongside the idea that a successful crusade should end with the formation of a new Crusader state, I also think there should be more collaboration between Crusader leaders. In both Medieval 2 and the Crusader Kings games, crusades feel like a mad dash and a free-for-all with no coordination. I'd love the idea that you need to meet at a certain point before proceeding together onto the target, attacking the same places, defeating the enemy by banding together. You know, a bit like they actually did in the 12th and 13th centuries. Of course, you could mate like the Sicilian Norman, Bohemond, the first Prince of Antioch, and simply refuse to help out once you had what you wanted, but you of course would then suffer massive diplomatic penalties. And these campaigns don't have to be limited to just crusades in the Holy Land. Holy wars could spring up in other places like they did in Iberia and the Baltic. The wars don't even have to be holy, with the idea of Danish adventurers sailing off to conquer new and distant lands. I love that Total War games let you play the game your own way, but sometimes this leads to a repetitive experience. Perhaps some slightly scripted events, a step up from the crusade mechanics of Medieval 2, could be a great way to make campaigns more dynamic and unique experiences. And that's my pitch. What do you think? Medieval 3 on the cards? I think so. Guys from Creative Assembly, have your people speak to my people. We'll knock this thing out. Everyone's happy. But seriously though, Medieval 2 Total War is a game that is crying out for a sequel. I loved it so much back in 2006, and frankly, I still do. However, games like Crusader Kings and the Medieval Kingdoms 1212 mod have shown me all the ways in which Medieval 2 was lacking. Looking at the direction of Total War recently, I'm struggling to see how they pivot into a diplomacy-rich remake of a historical title. I really feel like they're on this fantasy vibe at the moment, and they won't be pulled away from it. And by the way, Warhammer fans, I don't begrudge that. They're not for me, but they are beloved by many, so I get it. But I sit here, hoping and praying that one day, maybe, Medieval 3 is coming. I hope you've enjoyed me trying to wish this game into existence. What would you include in your fantasy Medieval 3? If you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them in the comments, alongside any suggestions for future videos like this. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and oh yeah, go follow me on Twitter too. Seriously, I have like 3 followers. Please, this is quite a desperate plug. Go follow me on there, at @strat_Tom. And I have been Strat Tom, and I'll see you next time.